I think Reza mentioned the title of my paper, which is a change from what it was in the program. Let me just kind of lay out what I present in the paper. Just starting with the introduction, I just want to make clear that this is an updated version of a chapter that I wrote for a book I co-edited with Jonathan Schwartz called State and Society Responses to Social Welfare Needs in China. In that chapter, which was written in 2008, I argued that the dominant mode in China's NGO sector during the late 1990s and much of the 2000s was really not regulation. And here I was disagreeing with those who argued that state-NGO relations was best characterized by corporatist arrangements and that China's civil society was state-led. Instead, I argued that negotiated arrangements between the state and NGOs were becoming just as important, and if not more so, than regulation. In other words, the really interesting and important dynamic in the center were really happening below the surface of the formal legal structure. In this article, what I did is I employed the same framework to sort of review and update, look at recent trends from 2008 to the present. And in doing so, I've come to a different conclusion and find that the last few years in the NGO sector in China have been marked by greater attention to strengthening regulation and other top-down efforts to bring NGOs from the margins into the mainstream of society. As a result of these and other changes, we've also seen a greater range of negotiated arrangements between the state and NGOs taking place, often at the initiative of state actors. So unlike in the previous period where negotiated arrangements sometimes undermine the formal legal structures and were a way to often get around them, I think in this more recent period, negotiated arrangements appear to be more in line with, more reinforcing formal legal changes. And I argue that the result we may be seeing is the creation of a real corporatist state that is taking the lead in guiding the development of civil society. Let me just address the question of why I use this this analysis, this sort of framework, which is to look at three modes of interaction in the NGO sector. First of all, I wanted to highlight the wide range of dynamics that are going on in the NGO sector. Previous frameworks such as corporatism and civil society tended to focus too much on state regulation and on NGOs in opposition to the state. There was too much focus on the state, in other words. And I wanted to move the focus to other dynamics that get less attention. In particular, looking at negotiated arrangements and partnerships between state actors and NGOs. And by the way, it's good to see a number of papers presented today looking at this very area. And also, NGO strategies and initiatives to acquire societal resources. This is a topic that even gets less attention, but I'm also glad to see that some of the papers also address this topic as well. This framework builds on the work of other people such as Tony Seitz and Gao Bingzhong and Kang Xiaoguang, who have explored some of these modes in their previous work. And so my contribution, I guess, is to basically synthesize their work into a more coherent framework. By using this framework to examine trends in the NGO sector, I argue that we can arrive at a more multidimensional, more dynamic, and more realistic account that does not privilege any one perspective. I realize this is not an elegant framework that arrives at a surprising or counterintuitive finding, and maybe it can even get quite messy, but I think it's true to what's going on the ground. And for somebody who works in the NGO sector and wants to understand where it's going, this framework is helpful in providing me a big picture of the sector's past, present, and future. I want to make a note about methodology here. I use civil society in my title, but civil society is a very broad category that includes many different actors. So I draw most of my empirical evidence from the grassroots NGO sector, NGOs, networks, individuals who work in these NGOs and networks. But the same framework, I think, could be applied to other civil society actors as well. So also to get a sense of the trends, I said I'm trying to get a sense of the trends in the NGO sector since 2008. I rely pretty liberally on CDB, on China Development Brief articles, along with interviews and other documentary sources and conversations I've had with many people in the sector in my 2 years working at CDB. One reason to write this paper is to draw attention to the value of China Development Brief's reporting in covering important trends in the sector. Not many academics, I've noticed, really cite China Development Brief's independent reporting. To give an example, I think I was looking at the papers today, papers yesterday and the day before. I counted one citation of China Development Brief in the papers presented. I think it was Jennifer's article. But that's typical of other papers and articles that I read and review. I review articles all the time that come through my way. And I have to confess that before I came to work for China Development Brief, I also didn't use their work much. But I hope that after this presentation, you'll consider using China Development Brief as a source of credible, knowledgeable information and analysis. CDB's editor and 2 staff writers have an accumulated wisdom of over 20 years of continuous reporting on the grassroots civil society sector. And I hope that we can also make this a two-way street by asking others, asking scholars to contribute to China Development Brief's knowledge base and to create a stronger epistemic community, as I think Jennifer was pointing out in her paper. So let me talk about my findings from doing this modal analysis by looking at 3 modes of interaction, and those are regulation, negotiation, and societalization. And I'll define what each of these modes are, and then I'll look at the pre-2008 and post-2008 trends for each mode. Okay, so regulation. Okay, so what is regulation? What do I mean by regulation? I mean formal state initiatives and mechanisms designed to control and manage NGOs. This mode is highlighted in the concepts of corporatism and vertical organizing that emphasize the state's ability to control and co-opt social organizations. If you look at the period from 1989 to 2008, I think this was a period marked by a more comprehensive and systematic regulations. But they were not very effective because many grassroots NGOs, as well as international NGOs, were not included in this regulatory system. So they're not registered. So I wouldn't really call it a corporatist state-led system. I think this was more of a kind of a low-budget regulatory system that relied on other agencies to police NGOs on an ad hoc basis. It was a system better at containing NGOs than guiding their development. What have we been seeing since 2008? I think since 2008, we've seen a number of efforts, both at the local and the national level, to address the deficiencies in the regulatory system. We've seen local experiments in various provinces and cities to lower the barriers to registration and therefore bring more NGOs into the system. We've seen more regulations and guidelines to standardize NGO norms and behavior. We hear, I have on good authority, that there's a good chance of the revised national regulations coming out at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, and maybe even regulations about international NGOs, which would be quite surprising. So that's regulation. The second mode I look at is negotiation. By negotiation, I refer to voluntary interactions that take place between state actors that are acting in a formal capacity and NGOs. These interactions, while voluntary, nevertheless are vertical, asymmetric exchanges between a superior and a subordinate. This mode is emphasized in discussions of societal corporatism and clientelism, which focus on bargaining and reciprocal exchanges between state and social actors, between patrons and clients. In the past, negotiations between state and NGOs tended to be more informal, more ad hoc, behind the scenes, more personalistic. There were fewer formal, institutionalized, publicly visible partnerships and negotiations between the state and NGOs. Since 2008, we've seen more of the latter. That is, we've been seeing more formal, more institutionalized, publicly visible partnerships and negotiations between the state and NGOs. This is largely the result of greater state recognition of NGOs. The slogan that we've been hearing of social management innovation, 社会管理创新, that's used by top leaders like by Hu Jintao and also Xi Jinping. The growth of government contracting, the creation of party and state platforms and channels for incubating and developing NGOs. I visited several in Shanghai, Ningbo, and Chengdu. And also the holding of charity fairs in places like Shenzhen and Shanghai. The Shenzhen Charity Fair is the largest of its kind in China, and it's already been held for, I think, 5 years, and it will occur again in Shenzhen next month. In addition, we're also seeing a more formal and visible role for NGOs in advocacy and influencing policy. And this report, which we published in March of this year, and I think one of the best reports that China Development Brief has written, highlights a number of examples of how public advocacy has become more formal and more visible. These include the use of public interest litigation by environmental, anti-discrimination, and labor NGOs, legislative proposals that are brought to the NPC, the National People's Congress, and to the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference by members of the Environmental Foundation, environmental NGO, Alashan-Si, joint petitions that are brought by foundations to the State Council and Ministry of Finance and the State Administration of Taxation, calling for more liberal interpretations of tax exemption on donations, social media campaigning by organizations like Green Beagle on the inclusion of PM 2.5 into the air quality index, women's rights activists advocating on domestic violence and sexual harassment, and performance art by women's rights, AIDS, LGBT, anti-discrimination, and labor groups. So that's the second mode. The third mode is societalization. Societalization refers to, and I don't know, I came up with this term. I'm not sure if I'm really happy with the term, but what it refers to is NGOs that are engaged in initiatives that rely on societal resources, where the state is not a formal partner. So in contrast to the other two modes, societalization involves horizontal exchanges between relatively symmetric actors, and it signifies greater distance and autonomy from the state. Before 2008, NGOs were actually pursuing a number of societal strategies to develop and to expand their influence, and I'll list a couple of them. One, for example, is registering as businesses or affiliating with another social organization to get around the difficulties of registration. Two, accessing private or overseas funding. Three, collaborating with other NGOs and NGO networks, as well as networks of individuals. I think Andrew Murtha calls these people like policy entrepreneurs. Individuals in other sectors like journalists, academics, lawyers, entrepreneurs, and even government officials who are acting in sort of their own personal capacity to help civil society groups on common issues. Four, the use of technology like the internet to organize, network, and access funding. What's happened after 2008 in this area? I think after 2008, we've seen some positive signs. We've seen the rapid growth of grassroots NGOs that rely heavily on societal sources of support. And the NGO directory that we created in the mapping report that analyzed the data in this report of 251 grassroots NGOs, I think makes that pretty clear. Most of these NGOs, over 80%, were established after 2000. They're only about 10 years old or less. We've also seen more NGO networks, and we've been seeing NGO networks becoming more institutionalized and more mature. So an example of this is the Green Choice Alliance, which started by Ma Jun's Institute for Public and Environmental Affairs, has grown into a network of over 20 environmental NGOs around the country that monitor enterprise emissions. And they have a division of labor that they've worked out. It's a much more institutionalized arrangement than, for example, the Green River Network that formed in 2004 in the New River campaign. That was a network of a more loose network of individuals, like NGO leaders, rather than a more institutionalized arrangement that we see with Green Choice Alliance. In addition, we've seen networks forming in the areas of climate change, in the area of AIDS, gender, advocacy, disability. And finally, in terms of technology, there's been an important change in the use of technology with the advent of social media, which has had a big impact in helping NGOs organize, network, share information, access funding, and engage in public advocacy campaigns. So China Development Brief, for example, we have now a Weibo and we have Weixin. So we've joined the 21st century. There are, however, so there's some positive signs in societalization, but there's also some question marks. There's two question marks about some other societalization trends that I want to point out. One, as NGOs mainstream and collaborate with other sectors in more institutionalized and formal ways, there's going to be opportunities to access another important societal resource, and that is public recognition and trust, I think, which Christopher talks about in his paper. And the question is, and this is still an open question, can NGOs formulate strategies that will take advantage of this opportunity? And I think that still remains to be seen, especially given the difficult political environment in China. Secondly, another question mark is access to private and overseas sources of funding. Many grassroots NGOs still rely on overseas funding. And while many are diversifying their funding by getting some support from Chinese foundations and companies and the government through contracting of services, it's just not enough. So far, Chinese foundations have been pretty stingy, and government contracts will more likely trickle down to NGOs with close connections to the government than to grassroots NGOs. So, you know, I'm still kind of not very optimistic about you know, that trend. Let me just then conclude. What do I see looking at these three different modes: regulation, negotiation, and societalization from 2008 to the present? I think the good news for me is the growth of grassroots NGOs, new channels for accessing societal resources, and the growth of advocacy. The not so good news is the trends in regulation and negotiation as a result of recent government initiatives. These trends are more powerful, I think, because they're coming from the state, and they suggest that more NGOs will be incorporated into the system and made to be more compliant. Those NGOs that are excluded from this, in particular those that are engaged in advocacy, seeking a larger voice in the public sphere, are going to face harder times in terms of finding funding and in earning public recognition and trust. Unless the state liberalizes the regulatory system to include these NGOs, to allow them to register, which, you know, I don't see in the near future, or unless these NGOs that are excluded can figure out a way to partner with the state and show the state that they can be useful. Otherwise, I believe this group of more critical NGOs will find it more difficult to survive and may even feel compelled to change their orientation to be more politically correct. So in conclusion, if these trends continue, then I foresee, and I hope I'm wrong, but I foresee that China will move closer to a true corporatist type system that is capable of leading and guiding the future development of the NGO sector. Thank you.